Hey there, RIISE. It's good seeing you today. Happy New Year 2017. I don't know about you, but I am refreshed. I am ready to just take on this year and be of good use and support, not only to myself, but to others, particularly in this whole independent school world, choosing a school to go to, and once you're enrolled, kind of being as successful at it as possible, even beyond independent school education. So that's my thing. That's what I love to do, and guess where I am today? At an independent school. And look who I run into, Sydney Robertson, who is an amazing young woman who happens to be in college right now, but she has had a couple of iterations of independent school experience, from day school to boarding school, and her brothers have gone on to independent boarding and some day schools. So she and her family have had a lot of history with regards to independent schools. But again, when we talk about our schools, I continue to use that word "and beyond," because our schools are a means to an end in a way, right? And that is just success in life, not only academically, but spiritually and emotionally, and just doing good stuff. So, Sydney, how you doing?
Good, how are you?
So Sydney's still on break. Don't you remember those college day breaks? Go back until like the end of January. That's going to be over soon.
Yeah.
When it hit the real world. But you've been doing some real world stuff while in college. So why don't you just give us a little bit of a history of your academic experience thus far and where you are today?
So I started off around I started at Riverdale Country School in pre-K, so I believe I was 5, about to turn 6.
Mm-hmm.
And I stayed there until I was a freshman in high school, through my freshman year, and then I went to the Taft School, which is a boarding school in Watertown, Connecticut. And after graduation from there, I'm now at Wellesley College studying economics and Africana studies.
Wow, economics and Africana studies. It's a nice combination. So I hear a little bit of, kind of, that economics and Africana piece. I would assume that you probably are looking at the financial industry, but with through a different purview, right?
Yeah.
A different lens.
So I think I have always liked economics. I think I am very interested in it, but in terms of the classes that I found myself more passionate about in school, I think learning about African American and specifically African and Caribbean culture is something that I didn't think I necessarily learned in the independent schools I went to, and I don't know if that's just my independent schools.
Oops, sorry about that, y'all.
If that was just my independent schools, or if it was just like, and I do think it's more reflective of the American education system in general,
Yes.
that we don't really talk about African and African American history and cultural contributions rather than through the lens of slavery or Malcolm X and Martin Luther King, and even the views of those two people are still very monolithic. Of Malcolm X was sort of radical and didn't necessarily do everything correctly, versus Martin Luther King was the peaceful protester, and that's why we have the rights that we have today. And so in that, I found myself, yes, I was taking the economic classes I had to take for my major, but I also was drawn to the Africana Studies classes, and so in that I decided on that major, or those two pairs together. And so after college, my intent as of now is to start probably off in investment banking, but I don't know if necessarily that's what I want to do long term. And so I know long term I sort of want to do something more with civil impact, and specifically with Black people. And so I think studying that in college, learning more about it, understanding, will allow me to work better when I'm a real adult.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, kind of working in the community and giving back to the community, and putting financial resources in various communities that are underrepresented in our curriculum, right? In our schools. So I want to get right to an experience though that you had at your college, right? Recently, right after the election, and Sydney stood up and she spoke up about not necessarily a very unique situation, because it's been happening a lot since the election, the disruptiveness, the hatred, and the violence, unfortunately. But Sydney stood up. So tell us a little bit about that experience.
Yeah, so the morning after the election, so I go to Wellesley, and that's where Hillary Clinton went. And so the morning after the election, like much of America, we were pretty upset. I spent some time talking to friends. It's fair to say that the campus very much was in mourning, like much of the world was. And at some point, I was receiving text messages, Facebook messages, various other forms of social media messages alerting me that there was a car on campus, a pickup truck, with a Trump sign on the back of it. And so at the time, we didn't know that they were actually two local students from a neighboring college. But my immediate response was that it was two people coming out of their way, which they were, to harm our students. I didn't know if they had weapons. I didn't know what their intentions were, but it was very clear that their intentions were not to do anything good. They knew that there would be very few, if any, people on Wellesley's campus that were really in support of Trump. And so it turns out they drove through our campus screaming at the students. They would cut students off. They drove by the students of African descent home. And one of my friends actually asked them to leave campus when she was in another car, and they spat at her direction. And so obviously that was a very scary thing to watch, what we all sort of expected to happen, but happened so quickly. It happened in a space that for me prior to that had been very much a safe space. And I think that I do give Wellesley a lot of credit for trying their best post this incident to make sure every student on campus does feel safe. But I think sort of the environment that we almost had was we were secluded and we were sort of protected in the space, and their actions to come on our campus sort of completely broke that. Later that day, I started, again, and I think one of the biggest things I learned from this was just the power of social media and the power of technology and communication, because someone had identified the students through a video that they had actually posted gloating about it to Snapchat. And so a few things just served me of more the intelligence of the kids to post and basically say, I did it, this is me. But also a part that was more upsetting for me was it was clear that Wellesley's police department had not punished them enough in that moment because they felt so justified to nonchalantly laugh about it. And so I just immediately thought of what it would have been if it was me, what it would have been if it was my brother. And I told the police this when I spoke to them later in the week. I know with all of my heart that had that been me behind the wheel, or had that been one of my three black brothers who again have always attended independent schools, are now either in an independent school now or a graduate of an Ivy League institution, we would not have been able to just smile, because your reaction, it would not have been a boys just being boys. It would have been their violence, these criminals, which the action that they did was. And so in that moment, when I started receiving those videos, I was sort of upset with what seemed like was going to be another moment of boys getting away with, and specifically white affluent boys getting away with causing harm and having their parents or having the schools or having, honestly, society protect them yet again. And so I decided with a few of my friends to share it to Facebook, share the information that we had, share the story. We had photos, we had videos. Basically, all of it was, here you go, schools, here you go. This is the information you guys have, but I'm also sharing it to the world, because if the school did not have the response that we wanted it to have, which it ended up not, you can't Google those kids' names and you can't Google my name without seeing that story. So it was crazy how big it became. I went to sleep around 12 or 1 that night, woke up at 9 a.m. with 2,000 shares. And so at a certain point, it got around 10,000 shares, and I realized that it was
viral,
huge.
Girl.
Yeah, it was really viral, and but it sort of, for me, was really comforting, because in the moment after I woke up after the day of the election, or the night of the election. I was pretty shaken up, and I'd always had these beliefs that in some way America is just as racist as I've always thought, but the election sort of solidified that and proved me right. And I woke up just having this feeling of, okay, well, there's a certain point where people say, I will risk it all to fight for this cause. And I've always been one, I never necessarily understood when people are like, I'm sacrificing myself for America to go to war, because there have not been many wars that America has fought that I have felt this need to sacrifice something. But at that point I was like, well, what do I have to lose? If anyone is upset that I shared the video, then those are clearly not people I either want to work for or be associated with, and have had no issues with people that I'm employed with the story. And so, yeah, it was a tiring and still going on experience. Ultimately, the boys are back in school with very little punishment, but it's not really anything I'm surprised about. But I do think it did give me a little bit more faith in that, one, not all of the country wanted to elect Trump, and that's what we saw with the popular vote numbers, and also not all of the country will, most of the country will continue to fight back against this hate, which is something that I realize over the next 4 to however long this Trump's presidency has an effect on us. That's something I will continue to do. So while I will stay in school, while I will hopefully work in the financial industry, there is a part of me that will also be fighting to make sure that this country continues to improve and doesn't sort of go back all those years.
Advocate. I love that. So what would you, in closing, I'm kind of finishing up this post that I'm writing about post-admission season. Right about now, many applicants, and I remember feeling this way, and I know your mom did, we have this sort of euphoric exhaustion, like we're so excited about this admissions process for independent schools, and we're all hoping to get in, and there's a little bit of fear that sets in, what happens if I don't? But for those of us who we're on the other side now. We did get in. Yeah. We're currently enrolled. What advice do you have? Because I think it's almost negligent not to be upfront. We need to get past almost this euphoria of, oh my gosh, I'm in. I'm finally in, and settle into not only the benefits or the virtues of an independent school education, but also the I'm gonna say it, the shortcomings.
Yeah.
Okay. And so there's this constant balancing act, particularly social and emotional balancing act that comes into play for families of color. What advice would you say? You've graduated. You kind of looking back, you have one brother that's still kind of finishing it out.
Yeah.
What would you say to encourage people and support them?
So from this past semester, I took an education course called The History of Public Education, and I spoke to early on my professor, and I said, because she sort of would allow each student to decide what specifically within the American public education system we wanted to focus on for this semester. And so I said I wanted to really focus on African American education, and specifically African Americans in the public education system, because I myself have never been in the public education system. And so I wrote my final paper on a program in Boston called the METCO program.
METCO?
Yes. So it started in the 60s where they will bus. Mm-hmm. It started with just black students, but now it's black and Latino students from underfunded public schools in Boston, or in South Boston, to suburban, predominantly white public schools there's some in Wellesley, and other affluent towns around. And so through that lens, I specifically wanted to look at the social and academic impacts that being in a predominantly white institution has on black students, and looking at black students who while they are in school in white communities, have to go home to black communities, and how that sort of has an effect on the black communities and the white communities and their sort of identity as this bridge. And so looking at it, I think one of the huge things and I spoke about this earlier, that I realized that I didn't really realize until college that I didn't really get from my independent schools, was the lack of education about my own culture.
Yep.
And I think some of these schools are sort of very much geared to, where they're schools with huge Jewish populations. I remember learning a lot about the Holocaust and a lot about Jewish culture and Jewish history when I was growing up. And so I think oftentimes that will happen when it is under the realm of a white culture inside of the overall white society, but it doesn't necessarily will happen within minority groups. There aren't many independent schools that you hear saying that they learn a lot about African American history and a lot African American culture. So that's one of the shortcomings, and I guess my advice would say, for some students, I think that will often harm, and I don't think it harmed at the time when I was here. I don't think I had issues being a black student in a white school. But I think that's because my parents at a very young age instilled confidence, and I remember my mom said when I was in kindergarten, I used to tell the other girls they weren't pretty because they didn't have hair like mine.
Yeah.
when it, like you would think necessarily it would be the opposite. But I think parenting has a lot to do with
Yes.
it.
Yep.
One of the things it said in that I learned when I was researching, for parents that sort of they idolized white culture and you needing to accept white culture to be successful, those children most often rejected their black culture and rejected their black identity. But for the parents that sort of taught it, like if they both allowed you to go to these schools but also independently taught you about your own culture, and that's more than just, okay, we like this music, we like that music, but going to African American museums, going and learning about the same things you're learning in school, but really about how minority people have built this country.
Yes.
Those students are able to a lot better both accept the schools they're in, because they accept that they are also learning about themselves while also feeling a strong community or feeling a strong affiliation to the black and other minority group communities.
I couldn't have said that better myself. I might pull a line or two for this blog post that I'm completing, but it's absolutely true. It's incumbent upon us as parents to make sure that we are that extra